Picture this. A teenager sits in his room, editing videos alone on his laptop, and less than 4 years later, he becomes the youngest director in the history of the studio that's considered the most fashionable in modern Hollywood. And just this week, while his film is still raking in millions at the box office, that same studio finds itself at the center of a major scandal, because it's trying to claim ownership of an internet myth that doesn't actually belong to it. Sounds like fiction, and yet this is happening right now in July 2026. Hello, you're watching Just Sneak, and today we're breaking down the story of the film Backrooms, directed by Kane Parsons, a picture that grew from an anonymous post on an image board and turned into one of the biggest horror hits of the year. If you enjoy uncovering real intrigues and debates about who actually owns creative work behind the glossy facade of the film industry, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dives. And now, let's get into it. Let's start with the fact that this film has a rather unusual origin, nothing to do with the classic film industry. In 2019, on the image board 4chan, an anonymous user posted a single photograph, an empty room with yellow walls, bathed in the unpleasant light of fluorescent lamps, with a short, eerie description of what happens to a person who accidentally ends up in this space. No one suspected at the time that this post would become the foundation of an entire mythology. The photograph was quickly traced back to an abandoned furniture store in Wisconsin, and around the concept, entire communities on Reddit grew rapidly, adding details to the story, inventing creatures inhabiting these endless corridors, and building these endless corridors. The overarching lore of the so-called backrooms, the space between realities, where you can accidentally fall and from which it's incredibly difficult to escape. And here's where then 17-year-old student named Kane Parsons enters the story. In January 2022, he began uploading a series of videos to his YouTube channel Kane Pixels in a pseudo-documentary found footage format, inspired by this very internet legend. He wrote the script himself, shot himself, animated himself, and entirely created the visual effects on his home laptop using the free program Blender. The videos instantly exploded across the internet and collectively amassed around 190 million views. It was Parsons' version of the Backrooms, with the mysterious organization Async supposedly secretly researching these anomalous spaces that essentially became canonical for most of the fan audience, although formally, the concept itself didn't belong solely to him but to an entire anonymous internet community. As early as February 2023, Deadline reported that a feature film adaptation was in development with several major players: James Wan's Atomic Monster, Sean Levy's 21 Laps, Chernin Entertainment, and of course, distributor A24. Initially, the script was assigned to Roberto Patino, but later another screenwriter, Will Sudik, was brought in for rewrites, and the production process stalled due to the writers and actors' strikes that swept through Hollywood in 2023. So even at the start, the project was plagued by the typical complications of a major studio machine: changing screenwriters, production delays, and negotiations between multiple production companies, each pulling the blanket in their own direction. The writers and actors' strikes that parallelized Hollywood for most of 2023 hit the project particularly hard precisely because the film was already in a very early, fragile stage of development. Usually, major franchises weather such downtime relatively painlessly. They already have an approved script and a budget in place. But a project that relied on the enthusiasm of a young creator with no studio background risked getting stuck in limbo indefinitely. Essentially, the only thing that kept Backrooms afloat during this difficult period was the personal conviction of several influential producers, including James Wan and Sean Levy, that the material was worth bringing to the screen despite the industry chaos around them. The producer list in the film's credits ended up being impressive even by major franchise standards. Besides Wan and Levy, it included Michael Clear, Roberto Patino himself as one of the concept creators, Dan Cohen, Dan Levine, director Osgood Perkins, Chris Ferguson, Peter Chernin, Jenna Topping, and Corey Adelson. Such a number of producer names on a single project is itself an indicator of how many major studio interests converged around what seemed like a modest amateur YouTube phenomenon. If you enjoy this format, investigations into how internet myths become Hollywood blockbusters, don't forget to subscribe to Just Sneak so you don't miss the next deep dive. And we keep digging, because the really interesting part about the director himself is just beginning. Kane Parsons' biography is perhaps the most atypical case of a directorial debut in recent years. He's only 20 years old, and at the time of filming the feature, he was 19, making him the youngest director in the history of A24, a studio known for introducing the world to the boldest and most unusual authors in modern cinema. Yet he has no formal film school education, no experience as a second director or assistant on other sets, only years of solitary work at a computer, where he literally built, animated, and voiced entire fictional spaces on his own. In an interview with Dazed, Parsons admitted that he was always fascinated by places where people are practically never found. Abandoned industrial corridors, technical rooms, empty offices, and strange outdated architecture hidden from prying eyes. It was this obsession with empty, unsettling spaces that became the hallmark of his work, which he carried over from amateur videos to a full-fledged studio blockbuster. As for the scandalous episodes of his career, they are, surprisingly, not linked to personal vices or conflicts with actors. You won't find the usual Hollywood alcohol, divorces, or lawsuits here. The real scandal around Parsons erupted because of the very nature of the material he works with. Internet mythology created collectively and anonymously doesn't have the conventional institution of copyright, and when a major studio tried to extend its legal protections to it, a real conflict erupted between Hollywood and the online community. But more on that later, I promise. There's plenty to see. The shoot began in the summer of 2025 and wrapped in August of that same year by major studio production standards. That's quite a tight schedule. Casting also wasn't without its intrigues. For the lead roles, Chiwetel Ejiofor and Kristen Milioti were initially considered, with Ejiofor's involvement confirmed fairly quickly, but negotiations with Milioti never led to a final contract. Ultimately, the second lead female role went to Norwegian actress Renate Reinsve, known for The Worst Person in the World. Later, the cast was joined by Mark Duplass, Finn Bennett, Lukita Maxwell, and Avon Jogia. This turned out to be a rather unexpected cast for a pure genre horror film, with Oscar nominee Ejiofor at the center of the story, which itself was a notable move. Typically, films born from internet mythology can't boast such acting caliber. The very fact that an actor of Chiwetel Ejiofor's level, Oscar-nominated for 12 Years, a Slave, and known to mass audiences as Carl Mordo in the Marvel Universe, agreed to a lead role in a film that grew out of a teenager's YouTube videos became a sort of quality marker for the industry. Essentially, the involvement of such an artist legitimized the entire project in the eyes of the skeptical part of film industry, which initially viewed adapting an internet creepypasta as a clearly injurious endeavor destined to repeat the fate of failed attempts to adapt viral web phenomena. Renate Reinsve, in turn, came to the project at the peak of her own popularity following international recognition for her role in the Scandinavian drama, and her involvement gave the film a completely different, much more festival-friendly status than what usually goes to genre horrors rooted in internet folklore. A significant portion of the film's visual effects were created using the same principles as Parsons' original videos, using Blender and an approach as close as possible to his personal, homegrown method, only now within a professional studio pipeline with far greater resources. This is an interesting point. Usually, when an independent creator is brought into a big studio, their unique visual style gets diluted under the pressure of producers and industry technical standards. Here, the studio instead tried to preserve that very recognizable, slightly amateurish, unsettling visual aesthetic that made the original videos cult classics. Subscribe to Just Sneak if you want to see more of these deep dives where independent creativity collides with the big film industry. And we continue. Now let's briefly break down the plot, almost without spoilers. The film is structured as a dual timeline. On one hand, the viewer sees 1990. Scientists from the fictional research institute Async are reviewing restored archival footage of a researcher named Naren Warren, who once went on an expedition into and discovered anomalous space and never returned. On the other hand, a contemporary storyline unfolds about Clark, a lonely furniture store owner and failed architect who, in the basement of his own store, discovers a strange doorway leading to another dimension. When Clark disappears without a trace, his therapist Mary sets out to find him, step by step immersing herself in this unknown and extremely hostile space. Thematically, the film plays with the idea of abandoned, forgotten places of the modern world. Shopping malls, offices, warehouses, and transforms this very real, recognizable anxiety of urban desolation into a full-blown psychological and science fiction nightmare. emptiness and loneliness here become not just a backdrop but a fully fledged monster. It's important to understand that the organization Async itself is not a screenwriter's invention for the feature film, but a direct legacy of Parsons' original videos. It was there that he first came up with this secret structure, secretly researching anomalous spaces, and around it grew a significant portion of the fan lore on Reddit and other platforms. Transferring this concept to the big screen became a kind of litmus test for fans of the original web series. Would the major studio remain faithful to the mythology created by the author, or rework it beyond recognition for a more mass, audience-friendly narrative structure? Judging by the reaction of most of the fan community, Parsons and his team managed to find a balance. The plot backbone is recognizable to those who followed the YouTube videos for years, but the film remains completely self-contained and understandable to viewers who knew nothing about the existence of this internet legend before going to the theater. It's this rare ability to sit on two stools, pleasing the devoted fans of the source material while simultaneously winning over a mass audience from scratch, that critics call one of the main reasons for the film's commercial triumph. As for the intrigues around the release, a real race began. The premiere took place on May 7, 2006, at the iconic Aero Theater in Los Angeles, and the wide US release started on May 29. In its opening weekend alone, the film grossed over $81 million, setting an absolute record for A24 in its entire history. No previous studio release had opened that strongly. With a modest production budget of $10 million, global box office quickly surpassed $100 million. And by the time of the digital release in mid-July, various sources were reporting total box office approaching several $100 million worldwide. Kane Parsons overnight became the youngest director in history whose film topped the box office charts immediately after its premiere. Agree, for a 20-year-old creator of amateur videos, that's a completely phenomenal result. To appreciate the scale of this success, it's worth remembering that A24 is a studio that made its name primarily with festival dramas and auteur, often intimate films with relatively modest returns, aimed at a narrow but devoted audience of cinephiles. None of the company's previous releases had even come close to such opening numbers. Usually, the studio's success was measured in tens of millions of dollars over the entire theatrical run, not in a single weekend. That is, Backrooms effectively rewrote the understanding of what the commercial ceiling could be for a film from such a studio, and surely forced the company's leadership to seriously reconsider its strategy for working with projects grown from viral internet content. At the same time, the budget-to-box office ratio makes the picture one of the most profitable productions of the year in general. $10 million invested against hundreds of millions returned. Arithmetic like that makes even the biggest Hollywood studios nervous with their far more expensive and far less profitable franchises. Later, in mid-July, the film was released digitally and on rental services, which, following the studio's tradition, happened about 2 months after the theatrical premiere, noticeably earlier than most major releases, which usually keep theatrical exclusivity for a much longer period. Critics received the film generally favorably, albeit with reservations. Reviewers compared Parsons' visual and sound style to David Lynch's early works, the same attention to industrial, almost mechanical sound design, and the same obsession with the mysteries of electricity and strange technical spaces. At the same time, critics noted that the film works more on a sense of ambiguity and anxiety than on direct, concrete horror scenes, meaning it risks disappointing some viewers expecting the usual sharp jump scares and a clear structure of fear. The Variety reviewer directly called Parsons a true magician of atmosphere, noting that the director consciously keeps the true source of horror beyond the viewer's direct line of sight, turning genre horror into something resembling an anxious visual poem about the eerie and inexplicable. At the same time, the same critic honestly warned that such an approach could alienate audiences expecting a traditional, linear, frightening attraction. Interestingly, even before the film's theatrical release, some journalists jokingly speculated that this very picture had a chance to become the first truly experimental horror capable of grossing $40 million in its opening weekend. And, as we now know, reality turned out even bolder than the most optimistic forecasts, as the film surpassed that mark by more than double. Want more of these deep dives where the real film industry turns out to be more interesting than any script? Don't forget to subscribe to Just Sneak. There are plenty more stories like this ahead. If you've made it this far, thank you for your attention. And if you're not already subscribed to Just Sneak, Now's the perfect time to fix that, because the most scandalous part of this story is coming, the one unfolding literally these days. Now for the truly dirty details, the reason you're probably still here. Literally last week, when the film had already been in theaters for several months and was preparing for its digital release, a real scandal erupted over copyright. The thing is, At24 began sending takedown requests for fan content inspired by the Backrooms concept, and these weren't pirated copies of the film itself, but entirely independent works. Wallpapers, textile prints, games, and drawings that fans had been posting on platforms like Redbubble long before the film's release. One of the affected creators, going by the handle Gnarlinit, published his correspondence on Reddit, in which he claimed that his work, a recreation of that very original 2019 image, had nothing to do with the film or the studio's official merch, and expressed disappointment that a major corporation had turned on independent creators inspired by the very same internet culture on which that corporation ultimately made hundreds of millions of dollars. Then something happened that no one expected. Kane Parsons himself publicly sided with the fans against his own studio. In comments on Reddit, he wrote that such takedowns shouldn't be happening, and that he was personally looking into the situation. According to him, he had already appealed the removal of a specific work on behalf of the artist, explaining that the drawing was a recreation of the original iconic image, not a pirated copy of the film. This creates a unique and rather awkward situation for the studio. The director of their own blockbuster is publicly criticizing the legal department of the company that made him famous and openly supporting the people that company is suing. Lawyers and commentators who weighed in on this story point to a fundamental legal nuance. Copyright protects the specific expression of an idea, not the idea itself. In other words, At24 does own the rights to its specific film, its script, characters, and visual interpretation. But it cannot own the very concept of the Backrooms as such, because it was created collectively and anonymously back in 2019, before Hollywood ever got involved. Notably, even at the time of the first rumors about the adaptation, long before shooting began, Boing commentator Rob Bishiza predicted that the Backrooms would repeat the fate of another internet legend, Slender Man, whose Hollywood adaptation famously flopped with critics and was remembered as a bland film lacking the true spirit of the source material. In the case of Backrooms, this grim prediction, fortunately for the studio, didn't come true in terms of box office, but it did come true in terms of reputational scandal, just from a somewhat unexpected angle. A separate scandalous detail. The studio itself acknowledged that some of the takedowns might have happened due to automated bots that mass scan the internet for similar visual content and send takedown requests without any human involvement. So here we have a classic story of how a soulless corporate automation machine collides with living, organic internet creativity. And in this collision, the work of ordinary artist enthusiasts who had nothing to do with the production of the film itself is inadvertently trampled. Lawyers who publicly analyzed this case noted another curious nuance. Long before At24 even announced the film, independent developers had released their own video game based on the same Backrooms mythology, and this game exists completely separate from the cinematic universe, having no relation to the film studio's rights. This is a clear example of how difficult it is to draw a clear legal boundary around material that originally had no single author. The studio owns the specific film, Kane Parsons owns the specific videos, and his invented organization Async. But the basic concept of endless yellow corridors continues to live its own separate life in dozens of independent games, comics, amateur short films, and fan stories, to which neither the studio nor Parsons himself has or can have any exclusive rights. Drop a comment, by the way. What do you think? Should a studio adapting an internet myth have the right to legally protect the entire concept wholesale? Or would it be fairer to leave the original idea as public domain, as historically happened with folk legends and fairy tales? I'm genuinely curious to read your opinions on this. As for expert assessment of the film today, critics generally agree on one point. From a formal perspective, Parsons accomplished the nearly impossible. He transferred the intimate, amateur, almost homemade style of his original videos to the big screen without losing that very unsettling, hypnotic mood that made the videos cult classics in the first place. Reviewers noted that the director builds suspense through a sense of constant ambiguity, keeping the true source of horror seemingly outside the viewer's field of vision. which gives everything that happens an almost poetic, dreamlike dread. At the same time, this very feature became the main criticism of the film. Part of the audience, expecting a classic attraction with jump scares and clear narrative dynamics, left the theater slightly disappointed by the pacing and the abundance of atmospheric but event-sparse scenes. It's also telling how the film fits into the broader context of the year. Critics called 2025 and the following year a true triumph of the horror genre against the backdrop of the success of other genre films. Many ambitious, author-driven projects were released, and Backrooms organically fit into this trend, proving that even a film rooted in anonymous internet creativity can aspire to the status of a serious authorial statement, not just an exploitation piece on a trendy topic. For comparison, the previous major attempt by a Hollywood studio to adapt a similar viral internet myth about Slender Man famously flopped precisely because the studio tried to force anonymous collective creativity into familiar genre frameworks, completely losing the original atmosphere. Parsons, being himself part of that community and personally involved in shaping the Legends canon, managed to avoid this trap. The key difference is that most previous Hollywood attempts to adapt viral internet content handed the material over to experienced screenwriters and directors who were completely outside that culture, studying the folklore from the outside like anthropologists rather than as direct co-creators. Parsons, on the other hand, is himself part of that very generation that grew up on this aesthetic of abandoned spaces and spread it online for years before big cinema arrived. He wasn't translating a foreign language into Hollywood vernacular. He had been speaking this language from the start, just with a much bigger budget and technical capabilities at his disposal. That's why critics so often emphasize the sense of authenticity in the film. The audience isn't watching an imitation of internet culture carefully assembled by a major studio's marketing department, but an organic continuation of the work of a person who largely shaped that culture himself. If you enjoy how we dissect these stories, where independent creativity, big money, and legal disputes intertwine, definitely subscribe to Just Sneak, like this video, and share it with friends who follow these kinds of cinema stories too. In conclusion, Backrooms is far more than just a successful genre horror from a young director. It's a genuine cultural precedent. The first truly major studio blockbuster to grow literally from a single anonymous post on an image board, and yet manage to maintain the respect and trust of the very internet community that spawned the original community mythology, at least until the studio's lawyers got involved with their automated copyright enforcement systems. The story of this film raises questions that the industry had almost never seriously asked itself before. Who actually owns the collective anonymous creativity of the internet when it becomes a source of hundreds of millions of dollars in profit for a major corporation? Does a studio have the right to legally protect an entire mythology if that mythology itself was originally created by thousands of anonymous users without any thought of commerce? Kane Parsons in this story found himself in a rare role for Hollywood. A young creator who wasn't afraid to publicly criticize his own studio in order to maintain the trust of his original audience. Whether this position will remain just a beautiful gesture or actually lead to a revision of the company's policy regarding fan creativity remains to be seen in the near future. But regardless of the outcome of this particular dispute, the story itself has already entered the film industry as one of the most telling examples of how complex the relationship is between the old Hollywood understanding and the new, decentralized culture of internet creativity. It's also worth acknowledging that this story extends far beyond one specific film. The entertainment industry in recent years has been increasingly hunting for ready-made, audience-tested internet phenomena. Remember how quite recently other YouTubers and creators of viral content received their own feature projects from major studios, proving that audiences are willing to go to theaters for names that 10 years ago weren't taken seriously at all by traditional Hollywood. But it was precisely the Backrooms case that exposed a problem the industry preferred to ignore. If the source material is born not in a screenwriter's office but in an anonymous, collective, uncontrolled internet environment, then the studio simply has no clear, unambiguous legal framework into which it can fully corral someone else's collective creativity. Every attempt to do so meets resistance from a community that rightly considers itself as full-fledged an author of the mythology as the director of a multi-million-dollar blockbuster. That's why Backrooms risks remaining in history not only as a commercial record for a modest art house studio, but also as a kind of new type of legal precedent, Not a precedent in a courtroom, but in public opinion, where the studio itself, under pressure from criticism and its own director, is forced to publicly retreat from its usual aggressive intellectual property protection for future projects of this kind, and there will surely be more of them. This story will certainly serve as a cautionary tale. Before suing fans, it's worth thinking 3 times about where the material you just made hundreds of millions of dollars from actually came from. And in this sense, Kane Parsons' journey, from a teenager with a laptop to the youngest millionaire director in A24 history, looks far more interesting than any script written by professional Hollywood screenwriters. It's a story about how internet culture, which existed alongside the big industry for decades and almost never intersected with it on equal terms, suddenly became so valuable that traditional Hollywood was forced to come to it on its terms, not the other way around, and how this story will develop further, whether it will become a model for dozens of future projects or, on the contrary, a warning about what happens when you try to privatize collective creativity, will continue to follow together with you. What do you think? Is the studio's position justified in trying to protect its investment in the adaptation? Or is the truth on the side of the fans and independent artists who created this mythology long before the big money arrived? Share your opinion in the comments below this video. Discuss it with other viewers. I'm genuinely curious which side will gather more supporters. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe to Just Sneak, hit like, and see you in the next video, where we'll break down another cinema story whose behind-the-scenes drama you probably never suspected.